Famously, in the late 1950s, Willis O'Brien, the man behind the stop-motion special effects in the 1933 King Kong, was working on a revival of the character, in the form of the unlikely-sounding King Kong vs. Frankenstein, later retitled King Kong vs. Prometheus, in which Kong would battle an equally huge creation by Dr. Frankenstein that was, for some reason or other, stitched together from bear and elephant parts. While often talked of as one of the great unfilmed movies and a project with its own fanbase of unofficial art and even more unofficial animated or AI versions, it's hard to see how most audiences would not have found this a crossover too far, and perhaps it was for the best when producer John Beck essentially took O'Brien's idea and sold it to Toho, who then rebooted it into King Kong vs. Godzilla, a film that Kong purists have long despised, primarily for replacing O'Brien's stop-motion animation with men in monster suits, but which was probably a much better idea of reviving the character than having him scrapping a giant Franken-bear-a-fant monster. Nevertheless, the idea of Kong clashing with classic monsters of the 1930s clearly struck a chord somewhere. More specifically, it struck a chord with Shizuo Nakajima, who had been a Toho employee in the 1970s working on films like Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and Terror of Mechagodzilla. Nakajima was determined to somehow combine the seemingly incompatible worlds of Japanese kaiju and gothic horror, and in 1972 started work on the short fan film Wolfman vs. Baragon, a 3-minute movie that clashed Universal's lycanthrope of the 1940s with one of the second division Toho characters. This entertaining short was never completed, as instead he developed grander ambitions to match the Wolfman with Japan's most famous giant monster. It would take another decade before Godzilla vs. Wolfman, or more literally translated, legendary giant beast Wolfman against Godzilla, went into production, as Nakajima worked his way through various screenplay ideas in the 1970s. The original plan was simply to make a short fan film, but somewhere along the way the project evolved into a feature film with a Godzilla costume provided by Toho designer Fuyuki Shinada. This version went into production sometime in the late 1970s but was never completed. By 1983, Nakajima was ready for another go with a redesigned Godzilla suit and upgraded Wolfman, and reshot the earlier footage together with new material to create a new feature film.
あなたが一人で苦しんでる姿見るのが辛くて。
純子さん。
哲夫さん。
Inspired by both classic Godzilla movies and Hammer's Curse of the Werewolf, the plot involves a radioactive werewolf that grows to enormous size and rampages across the Japanese countryside, where he meets a revived Godzilla who has escaped after being trapped at the North Pole. In the classic tradition, the pair then battle it out, with Godzilla being the good guy, or at least the monster who's going to cause the least amount of death and destruction. Inspired by the 1960s Showa era of Godzilla movies, the film was an authentic-looking pastiche and something that most fans of Japanese monster movies would probably enjoy. But you know who almost certainly wouldn't enjoy the film? Godzilla owners Toho, that's who. Unfortunately for Nakajima and monster movie fans everywhere, he'd not secured permission from Toho to use their most famous character. This was perhaps a fatal mistake, given that Toho is a notoriously litigious company, something that he really ought to have known. They got wind of the new project while it was still being edited, perhaps because several of their former and current employees were working on it, and immediately issued a cease and desist, though, according to Nakajima at least, some 10 hours of footage had been shot. Still, the film was never completely edited and quickly became a lost project shrouded in mystery. In a world where writers are prone to inventing non-existent films for reasons best known to themselves, nobody knew if this project was ever more than journalistic fantasy, or at best a fan film that had never actually made it into production. It wouldn't be until the 2010s that actual evidence of the film's existence became concrete, with footage appearing online and at Godzilla fan conventions, where Nakajima would show clips and tease a final edit of the movie, which at one point was being claimed as existing in a 140-minute rough cut that was being edited to 100 minutes, and said that he was in negotiations with Toho for an official release. He even went as far as to announce that a DVD would be issued in 2016, though you'll be perhaps unsurprised to hear that the year came and went without any sign of the film. What we have had are a series of increasingly long, unfinished cuts of the movie that appear every few years online. The first was a 16-minute series of highlights, and the most recent, appearing in April 2026, runs to 40 minutes. None of these versions make any real sense as a story, but it's good to see longer and longer edits appearing. But given that none of us are getting any younger, maybe whoever is slowly leaking this online, perhaps just to test how much can be released without triggering legal action from Toho, could speed things up a tad. Is there any serious chance that this will be properly released? Well, history tells us to never say never. Weirder things have suddenly turned up, but it doesn't seem to be in Toho's interest to allow an 8mm Godzilla feature to be released, even if it's hardly going to harm the reputation of their top monster. And in any case, who's going to cough up what I suspect will be a hefty licensing fee for a movie that's going to have very niche appeal? There's also the possibility that the version online is all there is, that the claims of 10 hours of footage waiting to be edited are simply hype, and that nothing more than what we've already seen exists. But then I thought that about the earlier versions, so who, apart from Nakajima, really knows? And if the film really is still missing unshot footage, perhaps this might finally be a worthwhile use for AI filmmaking, filling in the gaps that can no longer be filled in any other way. As it stands, Godzilla vs. the Wolfman, Wolfman vs. Godzilla, whatever title you want to throw at it, has a curious cult status that seems to be from a weird parallel universe where the film is an established part of kaiju cinema. There are bootleg DVDs, fan-created posters and lobby cards, even action figures. Frankly, at this point, any efforts to suppress the film have clearly failed, and Toho are just making themselves look like mean-spirited bullies by continuing to quash the project. Maybe they should follow the example of franchises like Star Trek and Star Wars, allowing fan-fiction projects like this to exist as long as they're not commercially released. There's actually a lot of goodwill to be secured from not crapping on your fanbase. If you've enjoyed this delve into unfinished cinema, then you know what to do. Hit the like and share buttons, hype this if you can, and subscribe if you haven't yet done so. Anything that can help get the old gods of YouTube to actually promote this to the masses helps us out immensely. You can also support us through Patreon and Ko-fi, helping this project continue for the price of a meal deal. And if you want more pieces on unfinished or unmade movies, let me know in the comments. Obviously it's hard to illustrate a film that doesn't exist, but if I can, I will. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.